Do you realize just how big of a mistake you've just made? Isabella Carter's voice was calm, yet every word felt like a sharp blade cutting through the air. On the other side of the witness stand, Victor Hayes sneered. He was confident. He was in control of the situation. A mistake, he scoffed. You're just a defendant with a silly ticket. What mistake could I possibly have made? Isabella slowly placed a stack of files on the table. Well, what if I told you that today? It's not me who's being judged, but you. The room fell into an eerie silence. A heavy tension filled the air. What could possibly cause a cocky officer like Victor Hayes to turn pale in the middle of a trial? What could turn a small case into something that would topple an entire network of corruption? You won't believe what happens next. Hit the subscribe button now to not miss the shocking truth. The Edward J. Schwartz Federal Court was as bustling as usual that morning. Lawyers hurried past, their hands full of case files. Plaintiffs and defendants quietly consulted with their attorneys. Court clerks reviewed paperwork, and security personnel stood at attention at the entrance, scanning every person who walked in. On the surface, there was nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary for the hundreds of hearings held here every day. But deep within this vast building, a trial was about to begin, a trial that no one in the room knew would completely change the game. Isabella Carter walked through the main door, her cold eyes sweeping across the scene before her. Her footsteps echoed steadily on the marble floor, neither slow nor rushed. Standing tall, her neatly tied black hair framing her face, she wore a fitted black suit that highlighted her composure and professionalism. No one in the crowd took much notice of her. They assumed she was just another defendant, someone here to face the legal system and endure judgment. But Isabella knew this trial wasn't about judging her. She wasn't here to defend herself or beg for forgiveness. She was here to expose the truth. A light breeze swept through the open door, carrying a chill from the December morning. She lightly tugged at the hem of her coat, her eyes focused on the entrance to the courtroom at the far end of the long corridor. Adorned with ancient bas-reliefs, the door to courtroom 7C stood imposing, like a gateway into another world, a place where justice was supposed to be served, or at least where people pretended it still existed. As she drew closer, a group of court officers engaged in quiet conversation stopped abruptly, their eyes fleetingly scanning her with disinterest. A middle-aged man, likely a lawyer, whispered something to his client before they both vanished behind the courtroom door. Isabella slowly removed her sunglasses, her cold, sharp gaze flickering with an unreadable intensity. She knew exactly what would unfold inside today. She wasn't just facing the legal system. She was facing the man who had deliberately humiliated her, the one who thought he could trample her dignity with nothing more than a parking ticket. Victor Hayes. That name had been etched into her mind for the past 2 weeks. Ever since that night, he stopped her car on the empty road. Every word, every sneer of his, still fresh in her memory as if it had all happened just the night before. But this time, Isabella was no longer the one behind the wheel, forced to follow his orders. This time, she was in control of the game. The courtroom door swung open, revealing long rows of neatly arranged seats. The bright overhead lights reflected off the polished wood floor. The air in the room was oddly suffocating despite the chilly temperatures outside. Some people had already taken their seats, papers rustling, curious glances exchanged. The indifference of the court officers, and in front, the imposing witness stand where the judge would soon appear. Isabella took a deep breath, her hand unconsciously tightening around the briefcase she held. This wasn't the first time she'd stepped into a high-stress situation, but today, everything felt different. She wasn't a government agent on a mission. Today, she was just an ordinary citizen standing before the court to seek justice for herself. As soon as she entered, a familiar voice echoed from across the room. It wasn't loud, but it carried an unmistakable arrogance. "Oh, look who decided to show up." Victor Hayes leaned against a nearby table, arms crossed, a smug half-smile playing on his lips. He wore his crisp police uniform, the badge gleaming under the lights, as if he were standing at some ceremonial event, not in a courtroom. Isabella kept her expression neutral, not responding. She knew exactly what he was hoping for. He wanted to see her lose her temper, to see her lose control. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. No one in the room paid attention to the brief exchange, or perhaps they chose to ignore it. A few people whispered to one another, but no one spoke up. This was the courtroom, where justice was supposed to be served, but it was also a place where those with power knew how to bend the law in their favor. Isabella slowly walked toward the defendant's bench, placing her briefcase down and sitting in the chair. Her eyes never left Victor Hayes, but instead of anger, there was a terrifying calmness in her gaze. The judge hadn't appeared yet, but the trial had already begun long before he stepped in. This wasn't a typical legal dispute. This was a battle, one where both sides knew it wouldn't end with a simple verdict. Isabella could feel it in the air, and she was certain Victor Hayes could feel it too. He still thought he was in control, but what he didn't know was that at this very moment, everything was already slipping out of his grasp. Victor Hayes stood at the witness stand, his presence radiating an irritating confidence. He crossed his arms over his chest, his sharp gaze betraying the contempt he felt as he looked at Isabella Carter sitting at the defendant's table. The courtroom seemed to belong to him, as if he were the one calling all the shots. From his spotless, polished leather shoes to his perfectly pressed police uniform, to the way he stood with his back straight and an air of pride, everything about him oozed self-satisfaction, as if he believed he held absolute power in his hands. Isabella never took her eyes off him. She stared at him intently, without blinking, as though measuring him inch by inch. But instead of anger or fear, her gaze remained eerily calm. Her silence was unsettling to Victor. He smirked, leaning toward the microphone in front of him, his voice reverberating through the courtroom. "Do you think you have a chance?" Just those few short words were enough to make some people in the room stifle a chuckle. He spoke slowly, emphasizing each word, as if offering Isabella one last piece of advice before she embarrassed herself. In his eyes, she was weak, a woman daring to challenge the power of the police, but unaware that she had chosen the wrong opponent. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. Although no one had spoken yet, the bias was obvious in the eyes of some. A long-standing officer with a respected reputation, a representative of the law, facing off against a woman without a lawyer, only a worn-out briefcase on the table. To them, the outcome of this battle had been decided long before it even began. Isabella remained silent. She didn't rebut, didn't show fear or anger. Instead, she calmly placed her briefcase down on the table, her head held high, her eyes locked on Victor. Victor raised an eyebrow. He was expecting a different reaction: confusion, panic, perhaps even anger. But what he received was a faint smile curling at the corner of Isabella's lips, a smile that held no trace of fear. At that moment, a strange feeling crept into Victor's chest. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he began to sense that this wasn't going to be an ordinary trial. Why was he so arrogant and confident? Let's rewind to 2 weeks ago. The night was eerily calm, with the yellow streetlights casting long shadows across the deserted streets. San Diego at night had a peculiar kind of beauty, quiet yet filled with an emptiness that felt almost haunting. Isabella Carter was driving slowly through the quiet roads, relishing the stillness after a hectic day. She had grown accustomed to the fast pace of life, but in these moments, she finally had space to reflect on more important things: her work, her life, and sometimes, the things that she couldn't control. She often found peace in these quiet hours when the world around her seemed to sleep, allowing her to escape the noise of her daily existence. But as she navigated the dark streets, a flickering light suddenly caught her eye in the rearview mirror. The red and blue lights of a siren illuminated the rear window of her car, their harsh glow cutting through the calm of the night, followed by the echo of a siren piercing through the silence. Isabella immediately checked her speed, her turn signal, and glanced at the dashboard to ensure everything was in order. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet the patrol car continued to tail her, forcing her to pull over to the side. A sense of unease began to settle in her stomach. It wasn't the first time she had been stopped by the police, but there was something about this situation that felt different. The area was empty, there were no other cars in sight, and no traffic cameras to hold anyone accountable. It was just the dim lights of the street and the oppressive silence, broken only by the distant hum of the engine. The patrol car came to a halt right behind her, the headlights blinding her rearview mirror, making everything ahead seem a blur. Her heart began to race a little faster. She rolled the window down slightly, just enough to see outside, while keeping a safe distance. Then, the sound of heavy footsteps reached her ears, growing louder with each passing second. The steps were deliberate, slow, as if the person approaching was taking their time to create an unnerving rhythm. The air around her seemed to thicken with tension, and just as she expected, the man appeared right outside her window. It was Victor Hayes. The moment she saw his face, Isabella knew that this was no ordinary traffic stop. There was something about the way he stood there, his eyes fixed on her, that made her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure what he wanted, but she was certain it wasn't just a routine check. This was personal. Victor Hayes's approach was slow, deliberate steps, the heavy sound of his boots reverberating against the empty street. He moved without haste, without the urgency one would expect from an officer on duty. No, his pace was calculated, each step a reminder of the control he believed he held over the situation. As he drew closer, the glare from the patrol car's headlights continued to flood the rearview mirror, casting shadows over most of his face. But Isabella didn't need to see his expression to know what it held. She could feel the chill of his presence, the cold intensity of a predator stalking its prey. He stopped just in front of the car, standing with one hand resting casually on his belt, just above his gun. The action spoke volumes. He wasn't just a cop performing a routine stop. He was sending a message. He was in charge here, and Isabella was merely at his mercy. The stillness between them was thick with unspoken dominance, and his posture made it clear that he expected nothing less than complete compliance. Without uttering a word, he lowered his chin slightly, and then, in a voice so calm it sent a shiver down her spine, he said, "Get out of the car." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request. It was an order, cold and final. No explanations, no justifications, just the raw power of someone who believed he could make the rules. Isabella's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her knuckles turning white. She felt the tightness in her chest, her heart rate quickening. This wasn't right. She had done nothing wrong. No speeding, no reckless driving, nothing to warrant a stop. Yet here she was, trapped in a dark corner of the city with a man who had clearly made up his mind about her fate. Her breath was steady, but her mind was racing. She was trapped, but not defeated. She wouldn't let him see fear, not yet. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice calm, though her insides were starting to churn. It was an innocent question, but it hung in the air unanswered, swallowed by the silence of the night. Victor didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, the only sound in the stillness being the faint hum of the patrol car's engine and the rhythmic beat of her own heart. And then, before she could process what was happening, his hand moved. It was so fast, so unexpected. In one smooth motion, Victor swung the heavy flashlight he had been holding in his hand, bringing it down with brutal force against her rear tail light. The sound was deafening, an explosion of crackling glass and the sharp pop of plastic shattering. Isabella's body jerked back in shock, her heart skipping a beat. She stared in the rearview mirror, her eyes wide as the jagged shards of the taillight scattered across the asphalt like a trail of destruction, gleaming under the harsh light of the headlights. For a moment, everything stood still. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath. Isabella's thoughts were frozen. She didn't know what to say, what to do. The calmness of the night was shattered, replaced by the unnerving silence of anticipation. She could feel her pulse in her throat, a surge of adrenaline making her hands tremble. Victor stood there, watching her through the shattered mirror, his expression unreadable. He slowly withdrew the flashlight, twirling it in his fingers with an almost casual air, as if he had just finished a simple task. There was no rush, no sign of guilt or concern. In fact, there was a faint smirk playing at the corners of his lips, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He was in control, and he was enjoying it. He leaned closer to the car, his voice low, almost as if he were savoring the moment. "Now you've done something wrong." His words hung in the air, chilling her to the bone. Isabella's mind spun as she tried to process the situation. He had just made up a reason to escalate this. He had created a reason to punish her. And more terrifyingly, she knew this was far from over. Victor wasn't just a cop on a routine traffic stop anymore. He had just become the embodiment of the abuse of power, and he wasn't going to stop until he had complete control. Isabella could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't just about a broken taillight. This wasn't just about a routine stop. This was personal, and he wasn't done with her yet. Victor stood there, the bright light from the patrol car's headlights still blinding the rearview mirror, casting his shadow long and distorted across the pavement. To him, this moment was nothing but a game, a performance where he was the director and Isabella was nothing more than a helpless supporting character, unable to fight back. He tilted his head slightly, a smug smile curling on his face as he seemed to savor every second of the absolute power he held. Now you've done something wrong. His voice wasn't loud, but each word rang clear, dripping with open mockery. There was no hint of concern or hesitation in his tone, for he was certain that she would do nothing to challenge him. Isabella didn't respond immediately. She took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. She didn't need to look at his face to know what he was expecting. A burst of anger, panic, maybe even pleading. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She had dealt with men like Victor throughout her career, men who thought that the uniform they wore made them untouchable gods in their own minds. And it was precisely because she was so familiar with types like him that she knew exactly how to handle this. Any form of resistance now would only be twisted into resisting arrest. "I'll appeal," she said, her voice calm, without a trace of hesitation. It wasn't a threat or an outburst of anger. It was a firm statement of intent. Victor narrowed his eyes, the smile slipping from his face for a brief moment. His disappointment in her calm response was visible, but it didn't last long. In the blink of an eye, he regained his smug composure. He pulled a citation book from his jacket pocket, ripped a page out with a flourish, and held it up in front of her. Then, with deliberate intent, he tore a corner off the paper, leaving a jagged edge, and tossed it through the crack in the window, letting it fall directly onto her lap. "Go ahead," he said lazily, his tone laced with challenge. "Let's see if you can win against me." The moment seemed to stretch, as if time itself had stopped. A cold breeze swept through, rustling the trees along the street, but in the space between them, neither of them moved. Isabella remained still, her gaze fixed on the torn paper resting on her thigh. But there was no hesitation or fear in her eyes. Victor expected her to pick it up, either to argue, to get angry, or at the very least, to react. But Isabella disappointed him. She didn't pick it up. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she quietly inhaled, lifted her hand, and rolled up the window. Now the only barrier between them was a thick layer of glass. Victor stood there, looking at her with frustration, unable to get the reaction he had been hoping for. But Isabella no longer cared. Inside her mind, a plan was beginning to take shape. She knew exactly what he was thinking. He believed he had already won. He thought she was just a pawn in a game he had mastered. But what he didn't know was that this moment marked the beginning of the storm. And when that storm hit, he would have nowhere left to hide. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the cracks in the curtains, spilling across Isabella's small apartment. But she paid no attention to the warmth of the sun. In the quiet room, the only sound was the rapid, rhythmic tapping of her fingers on the keyboard, like the ticking of a machine working at full capacity. On her laptop screen, the NSA internal system appeared, its layers of thick security protocols appearing one by one. Isabella typed in her access code, her cold, sharp eyes glued to the interface as it loaded. The data she typed in was a single name, Victor Hayes. The system took a few seconds to process the request. When the list of results appeared, Isabella frowned slightly. She wasn't surprised, but the sight of the information in front of her still irritated her. Over 30 complaints, allegations of abuse of power, discrimination, excessive use of force. Most of these had been dismissed for lack of evidence. Some cases had never been properly investigated at all. The victims were mostly people of color, immigrants, or those unable to fight back against the system. Isabella scrolled down, her gaze landing on a particularly telling line of data. His dash cam malfunctioned right when complaints were made. A long list of incidents in which the camera on Victor Hayes's patrol car had experienced technical issues. The same reason, the same kind of data loss, but it always occurred at the exact times complaints were made against him. This couldn't be a coincidence. And finally, what caught Isabella's attention the most? Suspicious financial transactions. A series of large sums of money transferred to an untraceable account linked to a major real estate corporation in the city. The cold, dry numbers flashed on the screen, but they spoke a chilling truth. Victor Hayes wasn't just an abusive cop. He was working for someone else. Isabella leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as her eyes remained fixed on the screen. Everything was becoming clearer than ever. This wasn't just a case of abuse of power. It was a web of corruption, and Victor was just one link in the chain. But the question now was, who was behind him? And how could she bring this entire system down? A thought flashed into her mind. If these transactions existed, then someone, somewhere, had to be keeping records. If the dash cam had been disabled, Someone had ordered the data to be erased. And if Victor had never been properly investigated, then there was someone behind him cleaning up any messes. She needed to find out who that person was, and she wouldn't stop until she had taken this entire system down. That night, the city carried an eerie stillness in the air. The night breeze swept through the streets, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the asphalt. Isabella left her office after a long day of staring at the screen, poring over every piece of data, every suspicious transaction tied to Victor Hayes. She had enough in her hands to put him in front of a court, but the real question was how to bring everything to light without being stopped in her tracks. As she drove home, a feeling of discomfort began creeping up her spine. She glanced quickly in the rearview mirror and saw a black car maintaining a steady distance behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it, but as she turned onto a less traveled road, the car remained on her tail, keeping the same speed, neither speeding up nor falling behind. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't a coincidence. She tried once more, changing lanes randomly, then suddenly making a sharp turn onto a narrow street. The black car followed. There was no doubt now. Someone was tailing her. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She couldn't let them know she had realized. Instead, she kept driving as normal, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching every move the car behind her made. As she neared her apartment complex, she made a sharp turn into a public parking lot filled with cars. She turned off the engine, quickly exited her car, and walked calmly but steadily into the crowd of people coming and going. The car followed, stopping at a distance, but no one stepped out. When Isabella finally reached her apartment, the unease still hadn't left her. She closed the door carefully, locking both bolts, and then checked the windows. But just as she was about to breathe a sigh of relief, her eyes caught the front door lock. A tiny scratch, nearly invisible to the untrained eye, but to someone as careful as her, it was unmistakable. Someone had tried to break into her apartment. The sudden ringing of her phone startled her. An unknown number. She stared at the screen, her fingers lightly swiping over the answer button before putting it on speakerphone. A deep, hoarse voice came through, distorted by the crackling of the line. "Stop now." Just 3 words. No direct threats, no signs of anger or urgency, only a simple command. But underneath it was a clear warning. They knew what she was doing, and they wouldn't let her continue. Isabella stared at the phone in her hand, her breathing slow but steady. She wasn't one to be easily intimidated. If they had gone this far, it meant she had truly touched something important. She gripped the phone tightly in her hand and, with a cold, deliberate motion, ended the call. They wanted her to be afraid. They wanted her to stop. But she wouldn't stop. As night fell, the city still blazed with neon lights, but the atmosphere around Isabella felt unusually cold. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. The message was brief, lacking a name or any sign of its origin. "I have evidence, but you're going too far." Isabella paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the words on the screen. A heavy feeling settled in her chest. Someone knew about her investigation. It wasn't a direct threat, but a warning, a reminder that she had crossed a line that those behind Victor Hayes didn't want anyone to cross. But it also meant that someone within the system knew what she was searching for, and perhaps they wanted to help her. She didn't have much time to hesitate. The second message arrived immediately after, along with a location: abandoned parking lot at the corner of Willow Street. 11 p.m. alone. Isabella narrowed her eyes, her sense of caution rising. A meeting in an empty parking lot in the dead of night? The trap was too obvious. But if this was truly someone inside, someone who held the key to bringing down Victor Hayes, she couldn't afford to miss this chance. She paused for a few seconds, then typed a single word: agreed. At 10:45 p.m., Isabella parked her car about 2 blocks away from the lot. She didn't go straight to the meeting point. Instead, she chose a roundabout route, checking her surroundings as she walked. The cold wind blew through the empty lot. The musty scent of old concrete mixed with the faint smell of gasoline. The few streetlights still flickered on and off erratically, adding to the eerie atmosphere. From a distance, she spotted a figure hidden behind a cracked concrete pillar. A tall, thin man wearing a baseball cap pulled low, a loose jacket, and his hands stuffed into his pockets as though he was hiding something. Isabella approached cautiously, each step echoing in the stillness, creating a rhythm of unease. She stopped about 3 meters away from him, her voice calm but wary. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. He glanced around nervously, as if he feared someone was watching. Finally, he lowered his voice, just loud enough for her to hear. "You don't know who you're up against." Isabella stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. She had heard such warnings before, but this time, there was something different. This time, it wasn't just an empty threat, and that made her more determined to uncover the truth than ever before. Isabella kept her distance from the mysterious man, her gaze locked onto him. The parking lot around them felt eerily deserted, with only a handful of dilapidated cars scattered like forgotten relics in the darkness. The flickering streetlights cast strange, distorted shadows across the cracked concrete, making the space feel even more isolated. The man's eyes were tense, flicking nervously between her and their surroundings, as if he were expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment. Without warning, he reached into his coat and pulled out a thin brown envelope, his hands shaking slightly as he held it out toward her. "Victor Hayes's financial records," he whispered, his voice strained, barely audible over the quiet rustling of the night air. "He's not just taking bribes. He's involved with a huge real estate corporation, and the money flowing through him is in the millions. It's all here." Isabella's heart raced as she took the envelope, feeling its weight in her hands. She ripped it open and skimmed through the pages. Bank statements, suspicious wire transfers, transactions that screamed of money laundering, figures that couldn't possibly be explained by legal means. This was it, the evidence she needed to destroy Victor Hayes, to take down the entire criminal web that had been operating under her nose for so long. She looked up, ready to ask more questions, but the man's demeanor had shifted. His eyes had gone wide, his face pale with fear. "We need to leave, now," he said quickly, his voice cracking with panic. Before Isabella could react, she heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat as a black SUV hurtled down the road, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator hunting its prey. The vehicle slid into the parking lot, skidding to a stop with the force of an impending storm. The bright lights from the SUV pierced through the lot, bathing the space in a harsh, blinding glow that made Isabella's heart race. A door swung open, and two men dressed in black jumped out of the vehicle with military precision, moving quickly, efficiently, like predators closing in on their target. They didn't hesitate. Their eyes were locked on her and the man, and their movements were sharp, rehearsed. It was clear they were professionals, not some random thugs off the street. "Run!" the man shouted, his voice full of urgency, as he spun around and darted in the opposite direction, his feet pounding against the concrete. But it was already too late. Isabella could feel the air grow heavy with tension, the seconds ticking by too quickly. One of the men in black drew a gun, aiming it skyward before pulling the trigger. The sharp, deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the lot, the sound bouncing off the cracked concrete walls and amplifying in the emptiness. Isabella flinched instinctively, her pulse spiking as the noise reverberated through her chest. Without thinking, she dropped low, throwing herself behind the nearest car, her heart thumping in her chest. She held her breath, praying they hadn't seen her, praying she wouldn't be the next target. The air around her was thick with the smell of gasoline and damp concrete. Her eyes frantically scanned the lot for any signs of movement. The man who had given her the envelope was nowhere to be seen, swallowed up by the dark, running for his life. Isabella's mind raced as she gripped the envelope tightly in her hand, feeling the edges press against her palm. The harsh light from the SUV swept over her hiding spot, and for a moment, she thought they'd found her. But she held her ground, barely daring to breathe, her fingers tight around the documents. She realized this wasn't just a warning. This wasn't a mere brush with danger. This was a trap, and she had just walked straight into the middle of it. The courtroom in 7C was thick with tension. Morning sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting a soft glow on the polished wooden floors, yet it couldn't dispel the coldness that hung in the air. The rows of public seating were filled to capacity, with some attendees there merely to witness an ordinary trial, while others perhaps sensed something more ominous was at play. But all eyes in the room were fixed on the central figure of the morning, Victor Hayes. He strode confidently up to the witness stand, his police uniform crisp and immaculate, the badge gleaming under the overhead lights. He didn't walk like someone defending himself in a court of law. He walked like a man who believed he controlled everything. In his mind, this wasn't a real trial. It was just a tedious formality to process a person he was certain would lose. He didn't even bother to hide the smug satisfaction on his face as his gaze swept across Isabella, sitting calmly at the defendant's table with an expression that was unreadable, almost unnerving. Victor adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began his testimony in a deliberate, measured tone, as though recounting an obvious fact. She resisted arrest. She failed to comply. He emphasized each word, his eyes briefly glancing at the judge as though reminding everyone that he was the one representing the law. I instructed her to exit the vehicle multiple times, but she responded with defiance and refused to cooperate. He tilted his head slightly, his face showing a feigned disappointment. For safety reasons, I had no choice but to act in accordance with protocol. The audience began to murmur. A few nodded in agreement, familiar with this kind of testimony. A police officer doing his duty, a non-compliant individual, and of course, the situation escalating. It was a narrative everyone had heard countless times. Victor knew this. He knew the system was designed to support him. But Isabella remained seated, not contesting his words, not interrupting him. She simply observed, as though allowing him to paint the perfect picture of himself, unaware that she was about to completely shatter it. Victor Hayes finished his testimony with a look of satisfaction, the kind of arrogance that comes with years of believing you're untouchable. He glanced briefly over at Isabella, expecting to see anger or frustration, the kind of emotions he had seen countless times from those who had been subjected to his abuse. He had become so accustomed to these types of cases. The people he oppressed would often shout, cry, and protest, but in the end, they were powerless. The system had always protected him. Today, he was sure, would be no different. But Isabella did not speak. She did not argue, defend herself, or attempt to fight back with empty words. Instead, she calmly placed a thick stack of documents on the judge's desk. The simple, deliberate movement caused the entire courtroom to fall into a stunned silence, a hush so thick you could feel the weight of it in the air. Victor's eyes narrowed. He didn't like the way the room suddenly felt, the unease settling over him like a heavy cloud. For the first time, a subtle sense of doubt crept into his mind, a nagging feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. He had been so sure, so confident that the system was on his side. But now, something was different. The judge picked up the files and began to flip through the pages. As he skimmed over the documents, the room seemed to grow stiller, as though everyone was holding their breath. The first piece of evidence was laid bare. Victor Hayes's financial records. Bank statements, transfers, large sums of money moving from a well-known real estate corporation directly into his account. It wasn't a single transfer, not one mistake or small payout. It was years of transactions, dozens of suspicious payments that painted a clear picture of someone on the take, someone who had been living off the system he was meant to uphold. The judge's eyes flickered to the next page, and Victor's heart sank. The dash cam malfunctions. One by one, every time a complaint was made against him, the cameras on his patrol car had failed. A pattern, a deliberate, calculated failure to record the very actions that could have been used against him. The evidence was damning. Then came the testimonies. Testimonies from more than a dozen victims. Not just Isabella, not just one or two people who had crossed his path. More than a dozen individuals, all with similar stories of being stopped, threatened, humiliated, and in some cases, wrongly imprisoned. Some of them had been so thoroughly erased from the system that it seemed as though they had never existed. No charges, no records, just vanished into thin air, their lives rewritten to protect the very man who stood at the witness stand. Victor's grip tightened on the podium. His knuckles turned white as the truth washed over him like a tidal wave. He had always believed that the system would protect him, that the same system that had kept him above the law would always shield him. But now, for the first time, he was realizing just how deep the hole he had dug for himself really was. This wasn't just a legal matter anymore. This was the end of the facade he had carefully constructed for so many years. The room was heavy with the weight of the evidence. Isabella, seated at the defendant's table, did not flinch. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any words could have. She had laid the trap. She had been patient, methodical, and when the time came, she had presented the perfect case. The system that had once protected Victor Hayes was now working against him. Victor's mind raced, but his body remained rooted to the spot. The realization dawned on him that he was no longer in control. The evidence in front of him, the testimonies from the victims, the financial records, Everything was there, neatly laid out, and it was all irreversibly damning. Isabella's eyes never wavered from him. There was no anger, no victory in her gaze, just quiet resolve. She had known this moment would come. She had known that the truth would come out eventually, and when it did, there would be no turning back. Victor Hayes, once untouchable, now stood on the precipice of everything he had built, about to lose it all. The system that had protected him for so long was now turning its back, and for the first time in his career, he realized he wasn't just fighting a losing battle in the courtroom. He was fighting for his life. The courtroom became eerily silent, the heavy tension hanging in the air, suffocating everyone inside. The murmurs from the spectators died down, and not a single person dared to speak. Every eye in the room was fixed on Victor Hayes, the man who had just moments ago stood proudly at the witness stand, exuding confidence and power. But now, he stood frozen like a statue, his hands gripping the edge of the podium, his eyes wild and lost as they skimmed over the documents laid out in front of the judge. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had grown accustomed to everything being perfectly concealed, every piece of evidence against him mysteriously disappearing, every complaint dismissed, every victim unable to fight back. But this time, everything had been exposed. Every shady transaction, every manipulated record, every testimony from those he had trampled over was all right there in that file, laid bare in front of him. Victor tried to maintain his composure. He swallowed hard, his hand trembling slightly, but he knew he couldn't let anyone see his fear. He needed an escape, a justification, a way to twist the narrative in his favor. But when he looked at the judge, her gaze was icy, unyielding. She had seen enough. For the first time in his life, Victor Hayes felt true fear. There was no way out now. No more excuses, no more lies. Nothing could save him. The moment the judge turned to the last page of the file, the heavy silence in the courtroom was shattered by the sharp sound of the courtroom door swinging open. All eyes in the room snapped toward the entrance. A group of FBI agents filed in, their black suits sharp as knives, their badges reflecting the overhead lights like cold steel. The air around them seemed to change, the tension thickening like a storm cloud. This was no longer a mere trial. This was the beginning of the collapse. The leader of the agents stepped forward, holding a stack of arrest warrants, his face grim and unwavering. His voice rang out, clear and firm, cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. Victor Hayes, you are under arrest for corruption, abuse of power, and tampering with evidence. The courtroom exploded. Gasps filled the air, whispers turning into a chorus of disbelief. Could this be happening? Could a police officer, one who had once held power over everyone in this room, really be arrested in the middle of a trial? This was unprecedented. Victor stood frozen in place, as though the world had suddenly tilted beneath him. His mind raced, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't process it. This couldn't be real. He had lived his life above the law, confident that nothing and no one could touch him. But now, as the words reverberated in his ears, he realized his world was crumbling. Desperately, he glanced toward the judge, his eyes wide with panic, looking for a lifeline, a thread of hope that could pull him back from the edge. But all he saw was her unflinching gaze, cold, unwavering, final. The room was silent, but for the sounds of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. No one would save him now. An agent stepped forward with mechanical precision, his movements swift and efficient. With a cold snap, he fastened handcuffs around Victor's wrists, the sharp clink of metal a deafening sound in the charged silence. The sound that had once echoed across the courtroom when he had placed countless others in cuffs now echoed for him. This was his moment. The man who had lived a life of power, intimidation, and unchallenged authority was now nothing more than a criminal, helpless and exposed. Victor was dragged out of the courtroom, his face pale, his once proud stance crumbling, as his eyes darted around wildly like a cornered animal searching for an escape that would never come. But no one in the courtroom was looking at him with pity or fear, only contempt, only disgust. His reign had ended, and he was no longer the one in control. The whispers grew louder, the mocking stares more evident, and the weight of the truth hit him like a crushing wave. Isabella remained seated, still, her eyes calm as the storm raged around her. She didn't smile, didn't take pleasure in his downfall. She didn't need to. She had waited for this moment. She had known from the very beginning that the system that had protected him would eventually be his undoing. The man who had thought he was untouchable, who believed he could manipulate and control everything, had finally been brought down. Her breath was steady, her heart calm, as she watched Victor Hayes being led away. She didn't need to say a word. The evidence had spoken for her. And now, the man who thought he could stand above the law was nothing more than a shadow of his former self, crumbling in the wake of his own lies and corruption. The storm had finally come for him. Victor fought, struggling against the handcuffs that bit into his skin, desperate to free himself from the relentless grip of the FBI agents holding him in place. His muscles screamed with the effort, but there was no escape. They held him firm, their bodies unyielding, preventing any chance of breaking free. Sweat poured from his brow, his chest heaving as panic seized him, his eyes darting wildly across the room, seeking anyone, anything that could save him from this nightmare. No, no, this can't be happening. His voice was a raw whisper, trembling, barely audible, as though even his own words betrayed him. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the reality of his situation slowly sinking in like ice-cold water. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. His whole life, his entire career, had been built on the belief that he was untouchable. He had spent years pulling the strings, manipulating the law, bending it to his will. He had made countless victims disappear, silencing them before they could ever raise their voices, erasing their pain, their stories. He was the system. The system worked for him. But now, everything was crumbling. The very system that had been his ally was now turning against him, exposing everything he had buried beneath layers of lies and corruption. This was the end. His eyes desperately sought out the one person he thought would be his easiest target, the one person who should have been powerless against him, Isabella. She was just one woman, just one person in a long line of victims, each one who had never been able to touch him. She had been insignificant, nothing more than a small obstacle in his path. He had dismissed her, crushed her in his mind, never once thinking she could be a threat. But now, as he looked at her, everything had changed. He saw her sitting there, calm, poised, unwavering, and it hit him like a punch to the gut. She had won. The woman he had underestimated, the woman he had seen as weak, was now the one who had brought him down. His heart pounded in his chest, an overwhelming sense of defeat flooding him. The truth, raw and painful, washed over him like a tidal wave. He was finished. Isabella didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even look at him with the satisfaction he thought she would. Her silence was deafening. That absolute calmness in her eyes, the unbroken focus on him, was more terrifying than 1,000 mocking words. There was no joy in her gaze, no sense of triumph, just the cold, quiet certainty that she had exposed him for what he truly was. Victor's breath hitched. The walls were closing in around him, the realization sinking deeper with every second. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the truth pressing down on him, and for the first time in his life, he was powerless. The agents began pulling him away, their movements cold and precise. He tried to resist, to twist his body away, but there was nothing he could do. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs seemed to echo in his ears, a sound that had always belonged to others. Victims, criminals, people he had dismissed as nothing. But now it was his turn. As they dragged him toward the door, he turned his head, one last desperate attempt to look at her, at Isabella, the woman who had brought him to this moment. His heart pounded in his chest, his body screaming in defiance. But his mind was fading, unable to comprehend the depths of his fall. He could see her there, calm, silent, unshaken. The last image burned into his mind was of her, the woman he had once considered insignificant, now the one who had shattered everything he had built. And in that moment, Victor Hayes knew without a shadow of a doubt, he had lost. No more manipulation, no more lies. He had been defeated, exposed for who he truly was, and there was no escaping it. The world he had controlled was gone, crumbling at his feet, and the one person he had thought he could crush had done the one thing he never saw coming. She had brought him down. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind him, and with that final, resounding sound, Victor Hayes's world ended. 3 months later, the final verdict was delivered. Victor Hayes, former police officer, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The courtroom that day was packed, more crowded than it had ever been before. Journalists, media outlets, justice activists, all were there to witness the fall of a man who had once believed that he was invincible. Victor Hayes, once a symbol of authority and power, now stood at the center of the courtroom as the embodiment of his own downfall. His once proud posture slumped as he sat in the defendant's seat, his eyes hollow, his face stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. Gone was the police uniform that had once commanded respect, the gleaming badge that had once made him feel untouchable. Now he was reduced to nothing more than a man in a dull prison jumpsuit, someone who had lost everything, his career, his power, his freedom. The room fell into a profound silence, one that felt heavy, oppressive. Victor was no longer the man who had walked into that courtroom with confidence, ready to manipulate the system in his favor. No, now he was just another criminal, exposed for who he truly was. The system that had once protected him now turned its back on him, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. The politicians who had once shielded him from the consequences of his actions denied any involvement, their faces filled with manufactured indifference. The colleagues who had once praised him, who had followed his every command, fell silent, pretending that they had never known him, never been a part of his machinations. As the web of corruption unraveled, everyone who had been involved scrambled to save themselves. The very system that had allowed Victor to operate with impunity for so long was now turning on its own, and Victor became the sacrificial lamb. He was the face of all the darkness that had been hidden for so many years, the fall guy for a system that had long been rotten to the core. But he was not the only one who would pay the price. After extensive investigations led by the FBI, the full extent of the corruption was laid bare for the world to see. The real estate corporations that had bribed police officers, the high-ranking officials who had turned a blind eye to the crimes, the senior officers who had actively participated in covering up the truth, all of them were exposed. The entire network of corruption which had shielded Victor and others like him came crashing down. One by one, those who had aided him, those who had turned a blind eye, were now facing investigations, prosecutions, and imprisonment. The web that had protected Victor for so long had finally been torn apart. This wasn't just the fall of one corrupt officer. This was the collapse of an entire system that had been complicit in his actions, a system that had allowed men like Victor to wield power without fear of consequences, a system that had given him the ability to silence those who spoke out and destroy the lives of those who had no way of fighting back. And now it was all crumbling, one arrest at a time. Each new headline, each new name of a person who had been arrested brought a sense of justice, a sense of reckoning that had been a long time coming. The truth that Victor had worked so hard to bury was now rising to the surface, and with it, the people who had been complicit in his actions were being exposed for what they were, part of a machine of corruption that had fed off the suffering of others. Isabella watched the aftermath unfold before her, her heart steady, her mind clear. The man who had once controlled everything, the man who had thought he could manipulate the law, was now reaping the consequences of his actions. Every piece of the puzzle that she had worked tirelessly to put together had fallen into place. The corruption, the lies, the manipulation, all of it was now out in the open for the world to see. And with each arrest, with each name revealed, Isabella knew one thing with certainty. This was just the beginning. The system that had enabled Victor Hayes and so many others like him was no longer the same. The walls of corruption had been torn down, brick by brick, and the people who had stood behind those walls were being dragged into the light. No one, not even those who thought they were untouchable, would escape the truth. The day of reckoning had come, and it was just the start of a much larger shift in the way justice would be served from now on. For Isabella, the fight was far from over. She had witnessed the destruction of one man, but she knew that the battle to dismantle the system, to hold everyone accountable, was only beginning. And she would be there, every step of the way, waiting for the moment when the final walls came down, when justice was finally restored to those who had suffered for too long. Isabella stepped out of the courthouse, taking a deep breath. There was something different in the air today, lighter. She could feel the warm sun on her skin, but more importantly, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: justice. The conviction of Victor Hayes wasn't just punishment for a corrupted man. It was a declaration that this system, despite its flaws, still had the capacity to fight back against those who exploited it. It was a victory not just for her, but for those who had been oppressed by him, for those who never had a chance to speak out, for the countless lives he had destroyed in silence. But Isabella knew all too well this wasn't the end. Today, Victor Hayes had been brought down, but out there were still hundreds, thousands of Victor Hayeses, men and women who still hid behind power, still exploited the system to cover up their crimes. She understood that justice didn't come from just one trial, but from battles that were long, relentless, and dangerous. And she would not stop. Isabella descended the courthouse steps, her eyes steady, her walk firm. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. The story of Isabella Carter is not just a fight against a corrupt police officer, but also a symbol of resilience and courage. She didn't have power, she didn't have a system backing her, but she had an unyielding will to stand up against injustice. And it was that will that led her to victory. In life, we will always encounter Victor Hayes, those who abuse their power, those who think they can trample on others without ever being held accountable. But justice does not lie in the hands of one person or one system. Justice lies in the courage of those who dare to stand up. If you see injustice, don't remain silent. If you are underestimated, don't lose heart. If someone tells you that you can't do it, prove them wrong. The world does not change because of those who accept their fate, but because of those who dare to challenge it. Remember, the truth can be hidden, but it can never be erased. Justice can be delayed, but it can never be stopped. And if you never stop fighting, the ultimate victory will be yours. Thank you all for watching and staying with this story until the very end. This isn't just about one case or one corrupt officer. It's about standing up against injustice, about never backing down when faced with adversity. If this story inspired you, if it made you think, or if it gave you the courage to speak up, then our mission is accomplished. But this is just the beginning. There are still so many stories that need to be told, so many voices that deserve to be heard. So, if you want more powerful, eye-opening content like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us on this journey. Your support means everything. Together, we can bring light to the darkest truths. Thank you, and see you in the next story.